This move immediately claims central space and opens diagonals for the queen and king's bishop, initiating a wide range of opening possibilities. This move signals the beginning of a French defense, a solid and strategic opening that aims to create a robust pawn chain and prepare for counterplay. In the center, this move establishes central pawn control and opens lines for piece development, aiming to build a strong pawn center characteristic of many classical openings against the French defense. This move, 2, d5, directly challenges white's central pawn on d4 and initiates the French defense, aiming to break open the center and achieve dynamic counterplay against white's pawn structure. This move develops a knight towards the center, reinforcing the pawn on d4 and preparing for further pawn advances or piece development, typical in the main lines of the French defense. Developing the knight to c6 directly challenges white's central pawn on d4, preparing to potentially recapture if the pawn is captured, and reinforcing black's own central pawn structure. This move develops the knight to its natural square, preparing for castling and controlling central squares while also potentially eyeing the c5 square, a common strategic battleground in the French defense. This move, developing the knight to f6, directly challenges white's central pawn on e4 and prepares for castling, a standard defensive maneuver in many openings including the French defense which has been reached. Here, this exchange of pawns in the center, known as the terrace defense, opens lines and clarifies the pawn structure, allowing both sides to develop their pieces more actively. This captures the pawn, opening lines for your pieces and preparing to recapture with the queen to maintain a central presence. This move, b-flat 5, initiates the classical variation of the French defense, aiming to pressure black's d5 pawn and develop a piece actively towards the kingside. This move, bg4, develops the bishop and pins the knight on f3 to the queen, a common tactic in this variation of the French defense, aiming to disrupt white's coordination. This move, h3, questions the pinned knight and aims to gain a tempo by forcing the bishop to retreat, potentially disrupting black's development and consolidating white's central pawn structure. This move resolves the tension and removes white's attacking bishop, but it also doubles white's pawns on the f-file, which can become a strategic weakness later in the game. This move recaptures the pawn while developing the queen to an active central square, preparing for kingside castling and putting immediate pressure on black's center. This move repositions the bishop to a safer square, preparing to castle kingside and consolidating black's position after the exchange of pieces. This move develops the bishop to a strong attacking square, aiming to pressure black's queen and potentially disrupt their pawn structure later. This move challenges white's bishop, forcing a decision and gaining time for black to develop further. This move resolves the tension on the c6 knight, clarifying the pawn structure for white and creating a doubled pawn for black on the c-file, which can become a long-term weakness. Black recaptures on c6 with the b-pawn, accepting a doubled c-pawn in exchange for maintaining piece activity and avoiding a weakened kingside pawn structure. Castling kingside solidifies your king's safety, centralizes the king's rook for future play, and avoids any immediate tactical threats arising from the open central files. Castling the king to safety is a prudent move, securing the monarch and preparing to connect the rooks for future activity along the open central files. This move repositions the rook to the more active e-file, preparing to challenge black's central pawn majority and potentially support a future pawn push. Like e5, this move aims to dislodge white's well-placed bishop on g5, but it creates a permanent weakness on the kingside dark squares after the inevitable bishop exchange. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square, aiming to exploit the semi-open c-file and pressure black's queenside pawn structure after the recent exchange. This move activates the queen, preparing to potentially challenge white's centralized queen and contest the open d-file. The rook transfer to the second rank aims to support the central pawn push e4-e5, potentially opening lines for the rook's and king's bishop while restricting black's knight. Black initiates a queenside pawn advance, aiming to gain space and potentially challenge white's bishop on b5 and control the c-file, though it does create a potential weakness on b6. This move repositions the rook to the open e-file, centralizing it and preparing to support a potential pawn advance or to exert pressure on black's king. This move reroutes the bishop to a more passive square, likely aiming to reinforce the kingside or potentially prepare for a queenside pawn advance while avoiding further contact with white's active pieces. This move begins to reinforce the queenside pawn structure and prepares to develop the queenside rook, potentially onto the b-file, which could become open after further exchanges. The move 16, rb8 prepares to contest the open b-file and supports the potential advance of the b-pawn, aiming to create counterplay on the queenside. This move prepares to reposition the knight to a more active square, likely c5, to challenge black's queenside pawn structure and pressure the d5 pawn. This knight move initiates a dynamic central pawn push, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and gain space on the kingside. This exchange removes a key defender of black's queenside pawn structure, weakening the b6 pawn and potentially creating opportunities for white's knight on a4 to penetrate. The recapture on d8 is essential to remove the immediate threat to the rook and to prepare for central pawn play and potential counterplay on the d-file. This move brings the queen back into central play, aiming to contest control of the d-file and prepare for potential pawn advances or pressure against black's somewhat passive pawn structure. This move repositions the queen to a more active square, aiming to support potential pawn advances on the queenside and also to keep an eye on white's central pawns, potentially preparing to challenge the d4 pawn later. This exchange of queens simplifies the position, which may benefit white by reducing black's counterplay opportunities in the center and on the queenside. This pawn recapture creates doubled pawns on the d-file, which can be a weakness but also offers a semi-open file for the rook to potentially exploit later. This move seeks to gain space on the queenside and potentially create an isolated d-pawn for black, while simultaneously preventing black's knight from reaching a more active central square. The knight repositions to f6, not only defending the central pawn and preparing for potential kingside expansion but also creating an escape square for the king if white were to launch an attack. This move repositions the rook to control the open c-file and supports the central pawn push, aiming to create weaknesses in black's pawn structure. This move reactivates the rook to the open b-file, preparing to contest it and potentially support pawn advances on the queenside. This pawn capture opens the c-file and challenges black's central pawn majority, aiming to create dynamic imbalances and potentially exploit weaknesses in white's queenside pawn structure. This move solidifies black's pawn structure in the center, preparing to activate the knight and potentially challenge white's control of the d5 square. This move is a strategic decision to shore up the pawn structure and prevent black's knight from potentially forking the king and rook on e1. The knight's daring advance to h5 aims to disrupt white's kingside pawn structure and potentially capture the f3 pawn. But it leaves the knight vulnerable to attacks from white's pawn and potentially other pieces. The rook aggressively occupies the 6th rank, aiming to pressure black's queenside pawns and potentially penetrate to the 7th rank, restricting black's piece mobility. This move boldly centralizes the knight, aiming to exploit the potential weakness on the d-file and contest the crucial d4 square while preparing to attack white's advanced pawns. This move repositions the rook to a more active file and supports the pawn structure, anticipating potential advances from black's knights. This move aims to activate the rook on the e-file, preparing to contest the open file with white's rook and potentially support a kingside advance or reinforce the defense of the e6 pawn. This rook sacrifice on d6 is a tactical gamble aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially open lines for white's remaining pieces, leveraging the discovered attack on the knight and the potential to create a passed pawn. This move seizes the open e-file, forcing white's king to retreat and allowing black to continue their initiative with piece activity. With the king exposed after the check, bringing the king to f2 is a necessary defensive maneuver to escape further immediate threats and consolidate the position. This move is a reactive attempt to regain lost initiative, but it allows white's king to escape the immediate pressure and potentially find safety on the kingside. The king repositions to the safer 3rd rank, centralizing and preparing to support the queenside pawn push or potentially swing over to aid the kingside if needed. This knight check forces white's king to a potentially vulnerable square, aiming to disrupt white's coordination and potentially win material by attacking the f3 pawn. This move aims to dislodge black's knight from the strong f4 outpost and improve the king's safety by moving it away from the central files and potential checks. This move aims to protect the king by creating a safer pawn shield on the kingside, anticipating potential attacks along the open g-file or diagonal. This move recaptures the pawn on d5, simplifying the position and aiming to exploit white's potentially compromised king's safety after black's rook swing. Black's move 31. Re8 reinforces the e-file, preparing to challenge white's control and potentially contest the open file with the rook, a standard strategic maneuver in rook endgames. This capture on a5 repositions the rook to a more active file, aiming to disrupt black's defensive setup and potentially exploit weaknesses on the queenside, though it also temporarily removes a defender from the kingside. This move aims to consolidate the rook into a more active position, potentially targeting the weak pawn on c2 or supporting a future pawn push. This move aims to reroute the knight to a more active square, potentially targeting the enemy's vulnerable kingside or reinforcing the defense of the c3 pawn and supporting further central play. This knight maneuver aims to occupy a strong central outpost on e6 or d5 if white's pieces are not adequately placed, potentially harassing white's king or improving coordination. The king's active centralization is a key strategic concept in endgames, and here it seeks to control the center of the board and prepare for potential advances or defensive maneuvers. This move reinforces the knight on f4, preparing to exchange off white's active rook on a5 and thereby simplify the position, which is often beneficial when you have an advantage in material or space. This move capitalizes on the misplaced knight by forcing exchanges and aiming to create a passed pawn on the queenside. This pawn advance opens the f-file for black's rook and also creates an escape square for the king on g7, while simultaneously attacking white's knight on e5. The king is now centralized, supporting the rook on the 3rd rank and preparing to assist in the defense of the pawn chain. This move exploits the discovered check potential against white's king, aiming to disrupt white's coordination and potentially win material or gain a significant positional advantage. The king must retreat to a safer square after the checks, acknowledging the dynamic but ultimately balanced nature of the position. This move prepares to safeguard the king and centralize it on a more secure square, aiming to participate in the endgame fight while simultaneously defending potential threats along the g-file. This move repositions the knight to a more central outpost, aiming to control key squares and potentially support a pawn advance or a future knight maneuver to the king side. This pawn thrust aims to create a passed pawn on the h-file, but it also weakens the king side significantly, potentially opening lines for white's queen and rook if black cannot support the pawn. The king's desperate flight across the board is nearing its end. This move repositions the monarch to a slightly safer square, preparing to potentially offer itself as a defense against further pawn advances. The knight's retreat to g7 aims to reposition defensively and potentially support a kingside pawn advance later, while also preparing to recapture if white's rook moves from the a5 square. This is a strong sacrifice to break through black's defenses, forcing open the king and creating immediate threats of checkmate. This move, capturing the knight on g5, is a desperate attempt to regain material, but it opens up the king considerably and allows white's knight to reach a powerful attacking square on f4, potentially leading to a swift checkmate. The current move, rxe1, is a logical recapture aiming to simplify the position by exchanging pieces and leading towards an endgame where white aims to exploit the passed kingside pawn. White has just captured black's rook on e1, and black's only legal move is to recapture with their remaining rook, returning it to the e1 square, with the opposing king exposed after capturing the pawn. This move initiates a decisive attack by bringing the white king into the action, aiming to support the central pawn push and create threats against black's vulnerable monarch. This knight check is a vital defensive maneuver to prevent the white king from escaping further into black's territory, aiming to force a simplification into a drawn endgame. After the recent exchange of pieces and the pawn push 42, nay 6+, the king must be repositioned to a safer square, and 43. Kf5 is a logical retreat to avoid further checks and prepare for a potential pawn race by supporting the g-pawn. White has just delivered check with the knight, forcing a series of exchanges and creating a passed pawn on the queenside. But black's knight sortie to e6 has complicated white's king safety. Black's recapture with the rook on e2 is a good defensive move, consolidating pieces and preparing to contest the e-file. This move initiates the endgame by exchanging the remaining rooks, simplifying the position and leading to a king and pawn endgame where black's passed pawn on the queenside will be a significant factor. This is a desperate attempt to create a passed pawn in a lost position, hoping for a checkmate net, but the king is too exposed and white's pieces are well coordinated to prevent it. The current position is a rook and minor piece endgame, and white's king must actively participate to support the passed pawn and coordinate with the remaining pieces. This pawn move is a decisive blunder, as it allows white to capture the knight and promote their pawn, leading to a winning material advantage and an easily forced checkmate. This move aims to create a passed pawn on the queenside by advancing the a-pawn, a crucial strategic goal in this endgame where material is balanced but pawn structure dictates the outcome.